Hey everybody, I'm Jim Maritato, aka Vank Maniac on the internet and host of Extraplasm podcast, and I'm back with another kitchen counter review. What's a kitchen counter review? It's a low production value review of a high quality, awesome Ghostbusters collectible or toy that I bring to you from my kitchen counter while nobody else is around. And today I'm super excited because we're gonna take a look at probably the rarest thing I've ever been able to show you. We're gonna take a look at some Mattel Matty Collector Librarian figures. I'm so excited about showing you these because they're super rare and super awesome. So let's get right into it. What we're gonna talk about today are some resin casts from the original wax sculptures for the Mattel Matty Collector Ghostbusters line. And you'll notice here that I've got 3 figures on the counter right now that are kind of different from all the others. You'll see that there's a series of painted and finished production figures, and then these 3 figures in the middle that are unpainted. 2 of them are sort of Eleanor Twitty Librarian human form ghosts, which we never saw produced, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the one in the center is of the librarian that most of us think of when we think about the Matty Collector line, because this was the production figure that came alongside this guy right here, of course, Ready to Believe You Egon, or Lab Coat Egon. So if you recall the Matty Collector line, if you were a fan of it, you got a pack-in ghost like this one right here that came with each of your figures, and these ghosts would not have full functionality and posability. We'll take Egon out of the way here for a minute so that way we can talk about these ghosts a little more. But you'll notice that these are ghosts with limited functionality, so you didn't necessarily get opposable limbs, on every single piece, but you would get some articulation. So in this case, you had arms that would move up and down, but they're not jointed at the elbow. They're just kind of static and just posable. And the head on this doesn't really turn or doesn't move. And each of these ghosts, if you look at them, if you pull them apart, there's a stand that you could take out, and you look inside and there's like a finished piece as to where that stand plugs in. So that was sort of the same concept that was going to be happening with all of these figures. All 3 of these we're going to talk about in a minute. But this figure obviously is the production figure. And what you've got here is the resin cast from the original wax sculpture. And one of the things you notice about this pretty quickly when you put them next to each other is just how much more detail you can make out of the one on the right, and that it's just a little bit larger. And this is true apparently of all of these figures that came out for the Mattel line. The original casts from the wax sculptures, or from the molds from the wax sculptures, were larger than what would come out in production. Now, for some of you out there wondering, like, Jim, how did you get these? Where did these come from? I was lucky enough to find or make contact with someone who worked for the company that did the templating for this line, meaning they would take the wax sculptures and then figure out how to make refined molds that they could then, cast plastic in overseas and produce one after another figure without a series of errors in them. So what you're looking at on the right is not like a prototype or a test shot that came out of the production mold, but a figure that essentially came out of the process of refinement from the original wax sculpt. And this is really cool because if you look at these again, you can look at the teeth, how much bigger they are. You can look at the expressions on the eyes, and just sort of to hold these next to each other in scale so you can kind of see. You can clearly see the one on the right has a sort of little narrower head and is a little bit taller. But what's really neat about these is that they are like production process tests. So as I wave this around anxiously and hopefully don't drop it. And if you're wondering why they're on expo markers as opposed to on stands like the production figures, it's because frankly, these don't have that finished piece in the middle of them. In fact, the other 2 we're going to talk about in a moment don't even have a hole that's this big. It's just coincidental that this one happens to fit on the top of an expo marker pretty easily and pretty stably. But you'll notice that unlike this figure, which obviously is all jointed together and put together and finished, this one has arms that come off because these were in fact piece by piece casted. And so I can take the head off of this and pull that out. And essentially, if you look, they're on here with little pegs. In this case, the head peg is metal, and that's kind of cool. So that way, that doesn't break off as easy. And the ones in the arms are actually, if you look at them, they're plastic. So each of these figures is very fragile as a result of this, obviously, because they're really thin plastic, and they were not really designed to be, shipped or handled as much as they were tests to see how well these molds were casting and whether or not there are errors in the process. So let me take a moment here to put this arm back in before I lose it and then do something bad to it and be really sad. But you can really see here, like when you take the head off, the detail on the sculpt of this head, because It's nice to get a good look. And you can see the ears. This is the place where I really see the difference in these two heads, is that if you look at that ear sculpt on this one, and then you look at the production ears, you can really see the depth of difference here in terms of the detail of the sculpt, if you can get the camera to focus. And so in contrast, if we kind of pull this one over and take a look at it, you'll notice that there's really not even like an indentation there. It's been filled in with paint. These are much, smaller. They're less refined because they're copies of copies over here, whereas you're getting something that came off of the original wax sculptures for these figures. And keep in mind, the Mattel line was all done by hand. The Plasma Series line today is all done like by Hasbro using CAD programs and 3D software for rendering like Blender. These were hand sculpted, with the first figures having a lineage back to, like the guys back here, Egon and Peter, having a lineage back to the Four Horsemen. But these, obviously, we don't really know who sculpted them necessarily, but we do know that this Cincinnati-based company set up the templating based off the wax sculpts, and that's where I was able to pull these from, was from someone who formerly worked there, who does not necessarily want to be known to the community, but was excited to be able to, kind of pass these on in terms of someone else keeping them in their collection. So just to give you a quick rotation there to let you see the detail, you can see here, like if you look here, you see these kind of little spots, little white dents here or divots. And what those are little, spots from the mold, rough spots, because these were, again, like test shots that they were doing in the process of refining or fixing molds to get them ready to go out to Asia, to go off to a factory to shoot out figure after figure after figure. But these are really amazing, really phenomenal. Again, you see a little rough spot here too, same kind of thing. But these are hallmarks, right, of like sort of the casting process and that refinement process. And so really, I picked up this figure first, figuring that this would be the only one I'd pick up, knowing about it. And it was really buying this figure that allowed me to get in touch with the seller on this one. This one, back here, we're going to talk about next, is the first Librarian lady that I was able to put in my collection about a year ago. And then I posted to Instagram. And if you had told me I was ever going to see more than one, I would have been completely and utterly surprised. This is, without question, the darkest one of these I've ever seen. I think there's about 10 of these that probably exist, that are known to exist. I won't name all the people who we know have them so that their houses don't all get robbed or something, but it's kind of funny to think about this, that there's probably only about 10 of these that exist in the wild that we are aware of. And even up to, like, say 2 years ago, people thought this was far more rare and that maybe we were dealing with 3 or 4 or 5. But this figure right here and this figure are definitely from the same mold, although they have some differences in terms of how they're put together we'll talk about. I have weighed them both, and they both come out with the exact same weight in grams. They've got the same amount of resin in them, the same kind of resin. They're just slightly different colors. And often when you find these prototypes, what you find is that they are in this light gray color, sometimes a little bit darker, sometimes a little bit lighter. Occasionally you'll find them with white heads or something, but this is without question the darkest one I've ever seen. And so I'm going to just say it makes it rarer than all the others, just so I can be cool. But because, to be quite frank, I'm not keeping both of these Librarians. It would be wrong to keep both of these Eleanor Twitties, and one of them is going to go off to visit a friend. But if you take a look at the detail on this, it's something that blows my mind every time I look at these figures. I'm going to take this off the expo marker to get a little bit closer here. If you look at the sculpt, look at the detail on the ruffles of this dress. I mean, it's just unbelievable when you think about the fact that all of this was hand sculpted. Somebody actually had to sit there and individually hand sculpt each of these lines, the wrinkles in her forehead, the wrinkles in her dress, all these little frills that exist along the, edges of the neckline of the dress are all hand sculpted onto this. And if you rotate this around, you can see that she's sort of got these two movable arms that can go up and down, but that's really the articulation she's got here. And even this one on the book that she's, where she's holding the book, she doesn't really have the ability to bend that elbow. Let's see if we can get back in focus here, because the other one wants to get the treatment and get the focus. But the book that she holds, I will say on the figure I'm keeping, the one I've had for the longest, these arms are a little looser than the white one. But if you take a look at this, you'll see that I've actually put this on with a piece of Quake Hold of putty to keep her arm on there so it doesn't flop off whenever I pick it up. But again, these are little pegs, right? Little plastic pegs that are really designed to just go in there to fit the figure's arm in for prototyping purposes. Whereas if we were to think about what this figure might have looked at in production or looked like in production, it may not have had bendable or movable arms at all. I think about, a figure like, say, Nunzio Scolari. You can look at him and he's got arms that go up and down, but that's all they do. They don't bend at the elbows. So we may have had something similar going on here where we would have got a ghost that had arms that could rotate but really didn't bend at the elbows. And again, if you look inside of this, you'll notice that, and this one's real dark, there's not really a finished hole in here for you to be able to stand this on. So it would have had that though. And that's the thing to consider, is that when people ask me about this figure, they often say, do you think this would have been like a standalone Ghostbusters figure, much like they did the Vigo figure, where he was a full articulated figure that you would have got an Eleanor Twitty? And my answer to that's no. I think everything here in terms of the design of these figures indicates that, this was very likely a figure that was designed to be a pack-in ghost. Now, who would it have been a pack-in ghost for is a really great question. Would we have gotten like first time visiting the library guys, which would have been kind of fun and interesting, like another set of Ghostbusters figures that would have been in different body bucks, but reused the heads? Or would this have been a pack-in ghost like for potentially Rookie? If you look back at the Rookie figure, you don't really have a video game specific pack-in ghost. And this is sort of, I think, at least from looking at it from my perspective, this figure really reminds me not necessarily of the Librarian ghost in the movie as much as it reminds me and evokes the Librarian ghost Eleanor Twitty from Ghostbusters, the video game. And it's sort of interesting to consider this, that like Rookie was the only figure from the video game that they actually produced for this line. The rest of them obviously are just figures from the Ghostbusters universe, but they were taking the time to do that, to sort of like go through and let's say, hey, let's see if we can make something specific to the video game to market it. And so one thing I will say about these figures that's kind of interesting to note is that both of these heads are glued on. So that's why you're not seeing me try to rotate them or twist them or anything. It's really just the arms that move here. I have seen versions of this prototype where the head is on a peg or is on a pin. And I'm sort of inclined to think that maybe that was something they were going to do originally, was make the head articulate. And to give you an example of what I mean, without knocking things over in the process of reaching for things, if you take a figure like, say, Tony Scolari, right? His head does have some limited articulation to it where it can turn back and forth. And he has arms that go up and down, and arguably he has more articulation than his brother does, but he's got a very different paint style and design. But in contrast to that, if you take something like the Nunzio Scolari figure, his head really doesn't move. It's pretty much pegged in there the way it's supposed to be and doesn't kind of change position. And the same thing goes with, sort of the production Librarian monster ghost, is that this head is not really going anywhere. So I'm inclined to think that, like, having run across two of these prototypes now, that the plan may have been to have a static head, the way the other ghosts that were coming out around the same time in the line were kind of designed. That being said, it is interesting to think about the idea that each of these figures, could have been designed differently. They could have simply put a joint in there or a turning spot. Now, if you look at the two figures here, you'll notice that there is a slight line in the neck on the one on the left. And this is because each of these figures is hand assembled, right? These are figures that were pulled out of molds by hand. They're not from a machine. They're not being produced on a production line, but rather by artists and casters who are doing their best at producing these to see what they're going to look like when they come out of a production line. So the one on the left is glued together, but there is that slight gap in the neckline, or the point where the head meets the neck. But I really love seeing this figure in contrast to the other one, because I think that it allows you to see the details in the sculpt differently. Personally, I still kind of prefer this one a little more because I think it's just kind of more unique and different from others we've seen. But it's really interesting to sort of see how the ruffles in the dress present on a much lighter sculpt. And in this case, you'll notice that there's a couple small defects in this version of the casting that don't exist in the other, which, potentially are reasons why I'm going to keep this one over the other one. But if you look, each of these has like an odd mark on the bun of it. And this one, it's on the top and it's very small. This one is a little more pronounced. And there's one other on the side of each of them that you can spot down near the bottoms of their dresses, you may notice this rough spot that exists right over here on each of these. And these are, again, rough spots from being pulled from the mold, or potentially there was like a vent hole there or something in the mold that then transferred over. And if you look at the two of them, you can see that my one on the right that I'm going to be keeping actually probably has a slightly little more of a deformity in the head than this one does in terms of shape. But if we were to take this one and tip it forward, you'll notice that that is not a hole in the top, but rather resin that was apparently in the bottom, because these are probably cast upside down, of the mold. And since there was some pre-existing dot of resin in the mold, there's a small dot of black. So to be fair, if you were to look at the Librarian monster ghost up close and really take a look at what she's made of, you'd notice that there's some blue specks in that, similarly from resin that was probably in the mold already, or not quite cleaned out, molds as they were doing these test shots and messing around with them. So if you look at the books on these, they're both identical. You might even notice that they both have the same kind of wear marks or defects in the cover of the book, that this one's a little more pronounced if you look at it than this one is. And they've got some small little edge wear on them from the same thing of like they're not quite refined enough to pull out of the mold. It would be really interesting to see what the production version of this figure would have looked like. Would it have been a solid figure that was then painted? Would it have been something translucent in the vein of something like this, of sort of the Nunzio Scaleri that they did? Or if you look at the way they did, the other ghosts in the line, like Slimer, he has clearly somewhat of a translucent kind of resin to him. And again, this is another figure that if you look at him, he has the hole designed in the bottom of him to put the peg together. So it's not unreasonable to think they might have just gone with like a purple resin or something that was slightly translucent and then done some paint work on them to make them look like they were coming out of the movie. But we'll never really know. But what I know is that this is probably the only time in my life I'm ever going to get to have two of these next to each other, which is why I really wanted to take the time to do somewhat of a little bit of a long kitchen counter review of these. But they're amazing. I'm really impressed by how detailed this sculpt is and how much work went into creating this figure. It is a damn shame that we never got to see this figure in production, but I'm stoked to have been able to pick up one for my own collection a year ago and the second one to be able to spread the wealth around. But I hope this has been somewhat informative, and thanks for tuning in for another kitchen counter review. And don't forget, you can follow Extraplasm at Extraplasm on Instagram, on X. You can find Extraplasm Podcast on your favorite podcasting platform. And of course, you can find Extraplasm Podcast on Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again real soon with something else cool to share in the next Kitchen Counter Review.